Hello, my companion in these quiet nights. Tonight, let us step into a strange and turbulent period of history, medieval Europe. But don't expect silk-draped princesses twirling in high towers or gallant knights kneeling in oaths of love. Because the truth is, if you were a beautiful woman back then, your life might have been far worse than you could ever imagine. Beauty, something that seems like a gift, could easily become a burden. Tonight, I'll tell you the story of women trapped in perhaps the sweetest snare history ever laid: beauty. We'll explore why beauty, something that should have been cherished, ended up making their lives so difficult. Before we begin, find yourself a warm corner, take a deep breath, and let yourself relax. If you find these journeys interesting and thought-provoking, don't forget to hit like or subscribe so I can tell you more stories. And hey, I'm really curious. Where are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment so I know where in the world you're joining me from. Ready? Let's journey back to the 1860s. You might think that having a beautiful appearance is a gift, but in medieval Europe it was sometimes a curse. Beauty was never a privilege. In the Middle Ages, if you were a beautiful woman, you weren't celebrated, you were owned. Not in the poetic sense of a knight's ballad, but in the literal sense. You could be traded for a land agreement, locked in a tower awaiting marriage to a king, or worse, labeled a witch for being strangely beautiful. A perfect face didn't prolong your life, it often shortened it. In 14th century France, beauty meant milk-white skin, cheeks flushed as if by Cupid's pinch, and most importantly, looking innocent, easily manipulated. Girls who blushed and lowered their eyes shyly in the presence of men were quickly picked by noble mothers for their sons. In Italy, the beauty standard was more voluptuous. They adored full-figured women with sun-kissed skin and bouncy curls. The kind of beauty that looked like it just stepped out of a church fresco. And just being beautiful wasn't enough. You had to know how to dance, sing, and smile as if you were inviting the whole room into a musical scented with grapes and scandal. And in medieval England, they fancied women so pale you could see their veins, fragile like someone who just fainted after 3 days of fasting for the Virgin Mary. The paler the skin, the sadder the eyes, the more likely you'd make a man believe you'd just fallen out of a theological poem. Sounds bizarre, right? So different from today's beauty standards, isn't it? Though each place had its own ideal of beauty, the fate of beautiful women in the Middle Ages was eerily similar. No one asked what you wanted. You were chosen like one would pick a precious item. In the Middle Ages, beautiful women didn't own their beauty. Their families did. Society valued it. And men decided how it would be used. If you were a noble lady, your beauty was seen as a long-term investment. From childhood, you were taught to keep your skin fair, posture straight, and laughter soft, because a loud laugh could lower your worth. But the ultimate goal wasn't for you to feel beautiful in the mirror. It was for someone to find you valuable in politics. When you came of age, you were unveiled like a showroom sample at a diplomatic banquet. You'd be judged from your neckline to the way you poured wine, and if you were lucky, you'd be chosen. But don't get it twisted, being chosen didn't mean love. It meant being married off. Married off to secure peace between territories. Married off to save political face after a military defeat. Married off because an uncle on the royal council thought you could soothe an angry duke. You had no right to refuse, because that beauty didn't belong to you. It had been destined to serve the nation since your first baby tooth. But what if you were just as beautiful, yet born in a damp thatched cottage on the village outskirts? You wouldn't be married. You might catch the eye of the local lord, then be invited to help in the kitchen, which really meant being summoned to his bed when his wife was away. If you refused, they'd say you were disrespectful. If you endured it quietly, they'd say you were promiscuous. And if you spoke the truth, the whole village would claim you tempted men with your shiny hair and mischievous gaze. The same pair of beautiful eyes for a noblewoman, a sign of good fortune. For a peasant girl, the eyes of a temptress. One wore silk gowns and walked toward the throne. The other had her head covered and was pulled into the kitchen's shadow. Beauty, in the Middle Ages, didn't save you from injustice. It only decided whether you'd be exploited in a palace or in a barn. And if you're watching this video in a warm room with the right to choose who to love, who to marry, or to choose to be alone, then you're already luckier than millions of women in the past. They were beautiful, intelligent, perhaps wrote poetry, painted, or saved lives. But they weren't allowed to love who they wanted, weren't allowed to say no, and weren't allowed to write their names into history. So, love your own beauty, not because it's valuable to someone else, but because now you get to decide what it means. Now, with the lights in the Great Hall dimmed, and curious listeners like you all settled in, let us open each door in the labyrinth of the lives of beautiful women of the past. Don't worry, I'll go first. You just need to listen. In the Middle Ages, being beautiful from a young age didn't mean you were pampered longer. It just meant you'd be married off earlier. Just as you were learning to read, they'd already begun marriage negotiations. Just as you learned to braid your hair, they'd ask whether you preferred lace or silk for your wedding dress at age 13. Sounds extreme? But that was the reality for many noble girls of the time, where a daughter's beauty was seen as an asset that lost value with age. So, better use it early before it depreciates. Some marriages were reserved when the girl was just 5. By age 9, a hand-drawn portrait would be sent to the groom's family. By 12, the wedding. Don't ask whether that girl knew what love was. People only asked, is she pretty enough to be wed? And of Brittany is an example. Born beautiful, the only daughter of the Duke of Brittany, she was seen as the key to preserving her region's independence. The result? Forced to marry twice, both times to kings of France, while she was still in her teens. And neither time was it her wish. It was because they needed her land, and her face made the annexation look more agreeable. Her beauty, once again, was a stamped envelope, ready to be sent wherever others chose. Being beautiful from childhood wasn't a blessing. Back then, it was more like a prearranged appointment, with a man you'd never met, a house you'd never seen, and a life you didn't choose. If it were you, a woman born in the Middle Ages, what would you do in that situation? Resist? Forget it. Because in the Middle Ages, you weren't just married off, you were forbidden to refuse. Love wasn't a choice, and resistance wasn't a right. It was a grave offense. Imagine you're only 14. A 45-year-old man fresh from a bloody victory comes knocking on your door. He doesn't propose, he comes to claim his wife. You panic, you cry, you say no. But no one hears that cry, because in the eyes of the law, that cry carries no legal weight. And if you did more than cry, if you ran away, or secretly loved someone else, you'd be summoned to court not to resolve emotions, but to convict your honor. Many women were accused of betrayal, not for spying, but for daring to love the wrong person, daring to marry without permission, daring to disobey a planned match. Some were sent to convents for life. Others were buried alive, literally. And not a few lost their heads, not for crimes, but for defying the role society had written onto their faces. There's a story passed down about a young lady in Castile. She was to marry a Spanish nobleman older than her father. The night before the wedding, she ran away with a servant, the boy she'd loved since she was 10. They didn't get far. The servant was beheaded in the forest. She was locked in a room. The next morning, the wedding still took place. But on her head, instead of a veil, were the whispers of the entire court. She's lucky to be alive. Terrifying, isn't it? Back then, rejecting a marriage meant rejecting your role as a proper woman, and society didn't let that slide. Because beauty didn't help you choose whom to love. Sometimes it just made you die faster for loving the wrong person. And if you think that after the wedding, everything settles down, that only happens in fairy tales. In real medieval life, getting married often meant being exiled. Many noble women, because of their beauty, lineage, and diplomatic value, were married off to lands they had never set foot in, where they didn't understand the language, didn't know the streets, and had no familiar faces. They left home as young girls, carrying a few carefully prepared wedding dresses, some dowry jewelry, and a panicked heart hidden beneath layers of powder and rouge. In their new land, they weren't just forbidden to speak their mother tongue. They were monitored in every word and gesture. A French princess marrying into England was expected to forget France. An Italian maiden marrying the King of Hungary was not allowed to cry for her home. Remember Catherine of Aragon, daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who left Spain to marry the Prince of England at just 16. She not only had to learn English in a matter of months but also adapt to the damp climate, bland food, and a palace where no one spoke her mother's tongue. And that was the easy part, because once there, if your husband was kind, you might survive. If not, you'd be locked away in a secluded wing like a prized prisoner, scrutinized daily by a foreign court, and expected to smile as though you were lucky to be married. No one asked if you missed your mother. No one asked if you wanted to write home. They just needed you to play your part. The life of a medieval woman was truly unstable and harsh. The story doesn't end there. You had to bear a son. You had to keep the peace. You had to play the role of a bridge, connecting two nations with a heart buried under a wedding gown. If there was one thing a beautiful medieval bride was reminded of long before the wedding, it was, you must bear a prince, not a child, not a healthy delivery. Prince. This wasn't a hope, it was a command. Because noble women, especially those marrying kings, dukes, or powerful lords, were seen as heir incubators. And your beauty only held value if it produced an heir. If you gave birth to a girl, they'd smile coldly. If you bore too many daughters, you'd be blamed because her body must not be fit for sons. And if you couldn't bear children, nothing more to say. You'd be deposed, cast out of the court, or worse, rumored to be a witch for having unnatural beauty but a useless womb. Anne of Austria, wife of Louis XIII, was seen as a failure by the entire court for 2 decades because she couldn't produce an heir. It wasn't until age 37 that she gave birth to Louis XIV, the Sun King, but for all those years, every meal was a silent trial. Every glance from a lady-in-waiting was a reminder that she was beautiful but useless. Many women, under the pressure to bear sons, died during childbirth before they even reached 20. But history does not record their names. It only records how many times they failed, and their husbands usually remarried, or brought mistresses into court, or wrote to the Pope asking for annulment. In those days, you didn't have to be a great mother. You only needed to be the mother who produced a prince. Nothing more, nothing less. So what happened if your husband died? When your first husband passed, whether from illness, war, or simply because he was 30 years older than you weren't granted freedom. You weren't allowed to return to your mother's home. More often than not, you were remarried. Not because you wanted to, but because your husband's family wanted to keep you in the system. Which meant, if your late husband had an unmarried brother, or an uncle needing political consolidation, you'd be encouraged to marry again. Still within the same family, but this time you had to pretend to be happy. Why? Because you were still young, still fertile, and, more importantly, still beautiful. Your beauty was a signboard that hadn't expired, and no one wanted to waste it. Isabella of Angoulême, wife of King John of England, after her husband died, wasn't allowed to return to France as she wished. She was forced to marry a nobleman nearly 20 years her junior, a vassal of her own son. Read that again. She, the king's mother, married her son's subordinate, and that wedding had nothing to do with love, only politics. The once beautiful woman, once Queen of England, became a movable chess piece, and where she was sent depended on others' decisions. In those times, beautiful women weren't allowed to go home. They had to continue the cycle of marriage, as if their destiny always had to be under some roof, just not their own. You weren't allowed to be a peaceful widow. You weren't allowed to mourn your husband. You weren't allowed to write poetry about home. You were only allowed to step into a second marriage carriage, to fulfill your role. And every time you had to smile as if this was your own choice. And even after being married off and married again, that beauty still didn't guarantee the simplest thing anyone would wish for, to be loved. In a world where beautiful women were raised like prized ornamental plants, tended to, displayed, the one thing they lacked most was warmth. You could be a queen, dressed in gold-threaded robes, standing beside the throne. But if you didn't bear a son, or if your words brought shame to the court, You'd be cast aside even within your own palace. Those who once admired your looks would start whispering about the poison in your blood or the coldness of your womb. Worse still, you weren't even allowed to be human. You couldn't be jealous. You couldn't be sad. You couldn't protest the fact that your husband had 4 or 5 mistresses, because as the mother of the nation, you were not allowed to have a heart. There's a letter said to be written by a duchess from Provence to her mother after 3 years in the English court. "I'm still alive, mother, but I'm not sure I'm still myself. I laugh all day, but I don't remember the last time I truly laughed." We don't know if the letter is real, but the feeling is. At grand feasts, beautiful women were summoned to play music, sing, smile, and display noble grace. But behind the scenes, many were forbidden to keep diaries, discouraged from making sincere friendships, and had to weigh every word they spoke for fear of being misunderstood, and turned into gossip fodder for the court. A French princess once said before she died, "I was my parents' most beautiful doll, and then became my husband's most expensive doll. But no one ever asked if I wanted to play that game." And if these beautiful women, after trying so hard to play their roles to perfection, ever once stepped slightly out of line, the same beauty that once earned them admiration would become the fastest weapon used against them. Because in medieval thinking, a beautiful woman who was not virtuous was twice as dangerous. They weren't just betraying their husbands, they were betraying the image society had placed upon them. A gentle, obedient, pure goddess. That's why, when a beautiful girl was suspected of having an affair, no one asked for proof. They asked, did she smile too long when speaking to the guard? Did she walk in the garden after sunset? Did she look at someone twice instead of once? And that was enough to be labeled immoral, enough to be watched, locked away, or worse, publicly tried, like in Bullen. And second wife of Henry VIII was famous not just for her beauty, but for her wit. And when she failed to produce a male heir, and rumors spread about her involvement with several men at court, she wasn't called misunderstood, but a seductive witch. She was executed in front of the entire court. In those days, a woman could survive being foolish, ugly, or unknown. But if she was both beautiful and outspoken, one small misstep, and she wouldn't just be forgotten. She'd be erased. And even if she did nothing wrong, didn't love the wrong person, didn't rebel, didn't sigh too loudly, she still couldn't live as herself. Because she wasn't a person. She was beauty. And once you are beauty, you are monitored. Since girlhood, you lived in rooms with curtains drawn. Everywhere you went, attendants followed not to protect you, but to watch you. Every letter had to be read before being sent. Every conversation had ears nearby. Every dress you wore, even the colors, had to align with court protocol. No private time to cry, no personal space to breathe. You belonged to a system in which your face represented your family's honor. Every wrinkle was seen as a flaw. Every glance off course was given hidden meaning. And when they praised your angelic beauty, they were also reminding you to live exactly like a statue. Historical records tell of duchesses who had to sit perfectly still for hours while artists painted their wedding portraits, until they fainted from their corsets being too tight. But no one let them rest, because if they were beautiful, they owed that portrait to the royal family. Painting gets framed. A beautiful woman gets framed by expectations. She wasn't allowed to be natural, to breathe deeply, to make mistakes. Whether at royal banquets or private tea sessions, medieval beauties had to maintain a flawless facade, like actors in a play with no intermission. They had to smile softly, walk gently, speak delicately, and even breathe delicately. They couldn't say they were tired, couldn't misspeak, couldn't talk back, even if the other person was spouting nonsense. A sad gaze could be seen as discontent, a silence too long as arrogance, because people didn't want to see the truth inside. They only wanted to see the holy mask on the outside. There were princesses who lived their whole lives with eyes that never reddened, never shed tears in front of others. Not because they didn't hurt, but because they knew tears would be called weakness, but the absence of tears would be called heartlessness. In a place where every action was interpreted as moral character, beauty didn't grant them the right to be human. It only forced them to become symbols. A statue that smiles eternally, even when her heart is colder than marble. The more beautiful you are, the lonelier you become. That might sound contradictory, but in the Middle Ages, beauty didn't help you make friends. It made you a target of suspicion. Other women around you, instead of forming bonds, often kept their distance, eyeing you as a potential rival. They watched how you smiled, listened to how you greeted people, and gossiped about whom you might be aiming for. As for the noblemen, they treaded carefully. If you were too beautiful, they wouldn't dare get close, afraid they'd be accused of flirting. And so, day after day, your only companions were attendants, gatekeepers, and the walls draped in tapestries. And even they were often instructed to keep an eye on you. You never knew who was genuine and who was quietly recording everything you said to report back to the Queen Mother or the Count. You didn't dare make casual conversation. Didn't dare ask anyone more than 3 questions. Didn't dare trust. Because in a world where every glance was calculated, your friendliness could be seen as trying to sway someone to your side. Just like that, a beautiful woman lived inside a splendid palace, yet felt as exiled as if trapped in a glass tower, seeing everyone, but never truly touched by anyone. The harsh truth was, beauty had an expiration date, and when you no longer fit the public's visual standard, you'd be replaced like a ceremonial robe. Maybe it happened after childbirth, when your face no longer held the same slenderness. Or when you turned 30, the age that, in the Middle Ages, marked a woman as past her prime. No one said it aloud. They just stopped seating you near the throne. They placed you farther down the banquet table. They stopped mentioning your name in royal gatherings. And then one day they suggested you should retreat to a convent for peace of mind. It sounded polite, but everyone knew it was a one-way ticket to oblivion. You'd be sent to some quiet countryside, where nuns recited prayers and no one asked who you used to be. If you were lucky, you'd copy manuscripts. If not, your only task would be to count candles each night. There were women who had once been queens, once greeted by thousands bowing, who lived out their days with cold brick walls and the sound of church bells. No trumpets, no parades, no more names spoken, because they had committed the gravest sin in a beauty-worshipping world. They had aged. From a distance, their lives looked like a dream. Velvet gowns, crowns, castles. But if you lived inside it, you'd realize everything had a lock, and you held none of the keys. They couldn't choose whom they married, couldn't choose where they lived, couldn't choose their servants, their tutors, the people assigned to monitor their every move. History loves to record them with grand titles: Duchess, Queen Consort, Royal Mistress. But it forgets to say, they were puppets in silk dresses acting out pre-written scripts. They might be sculpted into statues, painted in portraits hung in great halls, but they were never allowed to refuse the lives mapped out for them. Every decision belonged to a father, a husband, or a king. Even if they wanted to rebel, to run, to escape the palace, there was nowhere to go, because the world outside already knew their names and was ready to judge them. So they stayed, not because they loved that life, but because there was no other path left. Beauty didn't just draw attention, it made them targets. They were frequently touched, stared at, or became subjects of crude innuendo at banquets. If they reacted, they were said to lack grace. If they stayed silent, it was taken as consent. And if they spoke up, something strange happened. They got blamed. People would say, "If you're beautiful, you should know how to protect yourself." They'd say, "She probably didn't mind all that much." They'd say, "Well, look how she dressed, how she walked." While men were allowed to be drunk, to joke inappropriately, to cross lines, beautiful women bore the responsibility for the behavior of others. No law protected them. No one stood witness, because the harasser was often someone powerful. All they could do was endure and blame themselves for being too beautiful. A striking example is Jeanne de Clisson, a 14th century French noblewoman known for her beauty and fierce spirit. After her husband was wrongfully executed by the French crown, Jeanne publicly demanded justice. But instead of being heard, she was blamed for causing trouble, seducing politicians, and expelled from court. No one examined the injustice she spoke of. They only questioned how a beautiful woman dared raise her voice. In the Middle Ages, a beautiful woman who was also intelligent was rarely praised. More often, she was feared. People were used to the idea that a lovely face came with an empty mind. And if you dared show you were knowledgeable or worse, capable of argument, they began to feel threatened. Threatened that you were hiding something. Threatened that you might use your wit to manipulate men. Threatened that you could sway the royal court, meddle in politics, or plant dangerous ideas in the ears of noble offspring. So, even if you loved books, had a gift for writing, or simply asked why, you were quickly shut down. People advised you to embroider, arrange flowers, learn to smile sweetly, don't think too much. A real-life example is Christine de Pizan, a beautiful poet in late 14th century France. She was one of the first women in Europe to write about women's rights and to challenge male-dominated narratives in literature. Though welcomed at some courts, she was harshly criticized for writing too much, for being too sharp, and at one point even accused of using poetry to stir men to rebellion. Many male scholars at the time considered her a threat to social order. Some even believed that the more women studied, the more likely they were to go mad. And if you were beautiful and eloquent, they had a word for you, which, in certain medieval villages, it was believed that only magic could make men lose their minds with desire. And if a woman attracted many suitors, or caused a wealthy lord to neglect his wife and children, she wasn't seen as captivating, but as dangerous. No proof was needed, just a few whispers, a few envious glances, and a beautiful girl could be branded a witch. They'd say she used love spells, that her eyes were hypnotic, that she once whispered something that made a knight abandon the battlefield for her. Perhaps the most famous case is La Voisin, a 17th century French woman known for her seductive beauty and rumored clairvoyance. Though she served the nobility, including the mistress of King Louis XIV, she was accused of using love magic to control powerful men. Without a proper trial, she was sent to the stake, because beauty combined with spiritual power was seen as a terrifying force. And so, she was interrogated, likely forced to confess under torture, perhaps burned in the village square, before a crowd equal parts curious and relieved that the threat had been eliminated. The truth was, she had done nothing, except be beautiful and have opinions. If you were a beautiful woman in the Middle Ages, you were taught to use your voice for singing, but never for debate. Taught to write love poems, but never complaints. Taught to bow your head, never to stand up. Why? Because a career wasn't something women were allowed to have, especially not if they were attractive. Beauty was seen as the destination, not the beginning. And once you got there, you weren't allowed to go anywhere else. The more you stood out, the more society wanted you silent. Beautiful and rebellious was an unforgivable combination. You can see this in the story of Trotula of Salerno, a beautiful and brilliant 11th century physician who specialized in women's health and wrote pioneering medical texts. Though recognized by the school of Salerno, later manuscripts tried to erase her name and credit her work to men, because society couldn't accept a woman, let alone a beautiful one, as a scholar. With beauty, intellect, and a voice of her own, she became a figure too dangerous for history to embrace fully. Beautiful women were not encouraged to pursue education, power, or influence, because society didn't want them remembered for their minds, only their looks. History tends to remember beautiful women only if their deaths were tragic enough, or their lives scandalous enough to become anecdotes. The rest, those who lived quietly, endured silently, or made changes behind the scenes, are often left out. Not because they didn't matter, but because they were inconvenient to mention. Ancient books recorded the names of kings, generals, monks, but the women who wrote poetry, saved lives, taught others, or quietly shaped change, were struck from the record. Not because they weren't important, but because they were not fit to be discussed. History once overlooked women like Hildegard von Bingen, a 12th century German figure known for her expertise in medicine, music, and theology. Though respected in her time, much of her work was hidden for centuries afterward, because women shouldn't write philosophy, especially not a woman who was both beautiful and influential among the ruling class. Only when her manuscripts were rediscovered in the 20th century did the world begin to recognize the scale of the genius it had forgotten. And how many more like her? How many beautiful stories without endings, simply because the storyteller didn't think they were worth telling. Among the forgotten stories lies another, equally sorrowful path that beautiful women in the Middle Ages sometimes faced, not being chosen as wives, but being kept as mistresses. Some women, because they were too beautiful, caught the king's eye, not to be married, but to be kept close, like a flower picked not to be displayed in the grand hall, but to be placed in a private room where only one man could admire it. It might sound like privilege, staying close to the king, living in silk, wearing satin gowns, walking amidst marble halls. But in truth, you were only a long-term amusement. With no title, no security. Your status was no more than that of a luxury ornament, valued only as long as its owner was pleased. No marriage, no inheritance, no right to appear in official ceremonies. You lived in a small room near the main palace, waiting each night for a knock at the door. If lucky, you bore a child, but that child would not carry the father's name, and you remained an outsider to the royal family. They were not called ladies, had no power, no position, yet they still had to smile politely when summoned, remain silent during court affairs, and give birth without being allowed to ask for anything. They were kept not because they were respected, but because they were too beautiful to let go. Instead of becoming wives, they were fated to be the warmth of the throne, living beside power but never allowed to touch it. From afar, their lives seemed like golden dreams, velvet gowns, banquets, rare perfumes from the east, sweet whispers behind silk curtains. But up close, they lived in a lacquered cage. No title, no rights, no mention in official records. They lived within the palace but never belonged to it. Like night-blooming flowers, fragrant in silence, withering at dawn. Each night, they lay on embroidered gold-threaded beds, waking with an unanswered question. Will I still be here tomorrow? Because their presence, though caressed, was as fragile as the reason they were kept. Beauty, a small blemish on the skin, a glance cast elsewhere by the king, a rumor from the inner court, was enough to have them moved elsewhere, or worse, forgotten without farewell. Some were so beautiful they captivated kings, but were never seen publicly. Not invited to grand banquets, not allowed to stand beside the king before his people. They stood behind half-closed doors, listening to music echo through the palace, and waited not for love, but to be summoned as entertainment after political chessboards were cleared. They lived in luxury, but had no say over their own fate. That is the most insidious form of torment, having everything but recognition. You wore silk, but never a wedding gown. You bore the king's child, but that child could never be called prince without a mother of legal bloodline. And you, though mused to countless love poems, had not a single page in official history to carry your name. But there was more. These beautiful women chosen as mistresses also faced a far more dangerous enemy: the jealousy of other women in the palace. They were seen as intruders, as foreign silhouettes in the heavy tapestry of palace politics. The queen might have lost favor, but she still held power. The concubines may not have been as lovely, but they were many and deadly. To them, a beautiful woman without title was a ticking threat. No one said it aloud, but every glance held calculation. She caught the king's eye. She must disappear before she becomes a problem. The schemes always started small. A whispered rumor at afternoon tea, a vial of powder in a slightly different shade, a blood-stained handkerchief left in her chamber. But the endings were never subtle. Some were exiled from the palace on a rainy night. Some were accused of witchcraft and locked in dark, unlit stone rooms. Some vanished unspoken, unfound, as if they never existed. Because in the harem, nothing was more threatening than a beautiful woman who made the king forget his throne. And if she didn't fear, she would be taught. Not with swords, but with poison in her tea, a scratch in her mirror, or a misstep on the marble staircase. In that world, being just a little more beautiful, a little more graceful, a little more remembered than the length of a feast, was enough to make you a thorn in the eyes of the legitimates, and they would pluck that thorn by any means necessary. Beauty was a risk, but beauty in the palace was a suspended sentence, and you never knew when the thread would snap. And if you thought that by staying quiet, avoiding scandal, you'd be left alone, you were wrong. Because being the king's woman wasn't a choice, but a label. Once the king's gaze lingered on you for more than 3 breaths, you lost the right to love anyone else. No ceremony, no decree needed. Just one look was enough for the world to brand you as his. And from that moment on, you lost the right to be an ordinary woman. You couldn't gaze into another's eyes, couldn't smile too long at a palace guard, couldn't write a poem with too many words about longing. If you happened to fall for someone else, even just in thought, you broke a law not written in any code, but understood by all, betrayal of royal authority. Many beautiful women only dreamed of a simple life, to love a gentle scholar, to marry a cheerful silversmith, or to live peacefully away from the stares of power. But they were never allowed. They were hung on an invisible hook labeled, noticed by the king. No man dared marry them. No one dared love them. And they weren't allowed to love either. Imagine, you're 17, your heart just beginning to flutter at the sound of a lute in the garden. And you're summoned to the palace, not as wife, not as maid, but as the one kept. From then on, your life is a limbo. Not allowed to love, yet unable to refuse the love of someone you didn't choose. And if you dared break that unspoken law, you'd be judged not by court, but by society's eyes. The man you loved would be punished as an offender of royal dignity. And you, at the very least, confined, exiled, shamed, or, as has happened, made to vanish forever.
No swords.
No prisons, just a whisper. She was the king's, and she dared love another. And so, your beauty, the very reason you were chosen, becomes the very reason you'll never be free. The story of Mary Boleyn's sister Owen Boleyn is a bitter example. As the first mistress of King Henry VIII, Mary fell deeply in love with another nobleman, William Stafford. When they secretly married, the court shunned them, Mary was expelled, stripped of all privilege, and spent her final years in obscurity and poverty. All for daring to love after once being the king's. But that still wasn't the cruelest part. Even if you loved the king with all your heart, played the perfect mistress, reality would come crashing in when that beauty expired. Because beauty was the only reason you were kept. And beauty always had a newer version. Today, you were the admired flower. But tomorrow morning, a new bud might bloom younger, fresher, and most importantly, not yet capable of boring the king. Beauty in the royal court was not loved for its depth. It was displayed for its novelty. And when it ceased to be novel, you became a faded ornament, pushed into the dark corner of memory. No one told you when your last day would be. There were no signs that the king's gaze had shifted. Just one day you were no longer summoned. Another when a new girl strolled through the corridor you used to walk. And then at a banquet, your seat had been quietly moved further back. No one said directly, "You are no longer favored." They just stopped inviting you to dinners, ignored your presence in the garden, forbade you from entering rooms filled with music. And little by little, you realized you were no longer his, but still you were not allowed to be anyone else's. The story of Diane de Poitiers makes this brutally clear. The favored mistress of King Henri II of France, she was over a decade his senior, yet held his heart for 20 years through beauty and wit. But the moment the king died, Queen Catherine de Medici, overshadowed for decades, struck back, confiscating all Diane's property, banishing her from court, and forbidding the use of every symbol tied to the king's love. From a peak of hidden power, Diane suddenly became just another aging widow with no title and no refuge. That life made women smile with worry, wear makeup in despair, and look into mirrors as if performing a sacred ritual, checking how long they still held value. A single wrinkle was a warning bell, a strand of gray hair, a sentence unspoken. You weren't allowed to age, not allowed to tire, not allowed to be sad, and above all, not allowed to let someone more beautiful walk past you. But you couldn't stop time, and you couldn't stop power's gaze from seeking something new. So you lived not as a lover, but as a contestant in an endless competition, where the prize was temporary existence. Beauty in the palace was the sweetest promise, and the cruelest threat. You see, beauty didn't just fail to make you a wife. Sometimes, it cast you into the bitterest role of all, the woman who was loved in secret and forgotten in silence. Agnes Sorel is perhaps the most famous example. Astoundingly beautiful, loved by King Charles VII so deeply, he built a chateau just to keep her close. But she died at 28, amidst rumors of poisoning, and history remembers her merely as the first officially recognized royal mistress, not as a woman who ever chose her own path. Or Jane Shore, lovely, alluring, who captured the heart of Edward IV. But when the king died, she was paraded through the streets in shame, imprisoned, and died in poverty. No one spoke of her charm anymore, only whispered of the woman who once seduced a king. And if you think that being a legal wife or staying silent as a mistress would bring you peace, think again. Because in the Middle Ages, beauty wasn't just seen as an asset, it was an excuse. A beautiful woman walks through the grand hall, and men's eyes cling to her like invisible hooks. They say it's instinct. But if something happens, the first thing they'll say is, it's because she was too beautiful. She did nothing. But if she was harassed, the blame would fall on her. Beautiful women must know how to carry themselves, was the phrase that killed all protest. It silenced victims and excused the offenders, because the victim was too pretty. One haunting example is Margaret of Anjou, Queen of King Henry VI. Despite being royalty, she was constantly accused of seducing men to manipulate politics. Not because she did anything wrong, but because she was too beautiful and too intelligent, which many couldn't tolerate. Beauty became evidence not of allure, but of presumed guilt. If you were beautiful, you were held responsible for other people's sins. If you were beautiful, you were seen as a temptress, even when you stood silently in the shadows. That was the absurd price women of that era, and sometimes even today, still have to pay. And if you think that, at the very least, history would remember you, allow me to disappoint you once more. Because history, like old books, only opens to pages stained with blood or scandal. Beautiful women of the Middle Ages, if they lived quietly, endured in silence, and disappeared into the shadows of stone walls, were forgotten as if they had never existed. No one remembers the gentle woman who stayed silent, who knew how to be a wife, who cried without bothering anyone. But if you rebelled, if you dared love the wrong man, said something too loudly, or worse, got caught in a scheme not of your making, congratulations, you'd be remembered. But as the villain, Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, is a prime example. History dubbed her the she-wolf of France for overthrowing her husband, though in truth, it was the final act after years of betrayal and neglect. Meanwhile, the hundreds, thousands of women like her who never spoke up, never rebelled, never overthrew anyone, were not remembered at all. Because history doesn't write about the gentle. It writes about those who die violently or live scandalously. You were a kind queen? Sorry, no one tells that story. But if you dared to be angry, dared to love a knight, or burned in a chamber after being accused of witchcraft, congratulations. You've earned your place in the annals. Not because they cared for you, but because you made the story more interesting. So where, ultimately, does the problem lie? Is it beauty that ruins women? Or is it society with its prejudice, control, and obsession with ideal images that never gave them a real chance to live? It's not a new question, but it still aches every time we peer into the mirrors of history. Medieval women were not allowed to be beautiful without being doubted, not allowed to be intelligent without being threatened, not allowed to be kind without being used. They weren't allowed to write their own stories, only to act out scripts written by others. And the most frightening part is, their finest qualities, delicate faces, brilliant minds, compassionate hearts, became the very reasons they were punished. It wasn't beauty's fault. It was the fault of a society that valued appearance but not humanity. A society that clapped when beautiful women appeared, but turned away the moment they asked to be loved properly. So if you're living today and feel the pressure to always be beautiful, always be obedient, always be appropriate, remember, you are not the first to carry that burden, and you have the right to put it down, because history has long told the stories of powerful men. And now, as the candle in this palace dims, and you, the listener who stayed through the night, are still here, I just want to say one last thing, that history is not always just. It remembers battles but forgets sobs in the night. It builds statues for men with swords, but abandons the women who were forced to smile beneath invisible chains. They may not have left diaries, nor had history books written about them, nor been carved into stone. But they existed, they suffered, and they were beautiful not just in face, but in the courage it took to endure lives they never chose. So if you see someone beautiful today and think their life must be easy, remember them, the women of the past, once called treasures, but truly treated as property. Because beauty, without freedom, is just a gilded cage. And the woman trapped inside may have smiled sweetly, but it was a smile that history never bothered to hear the sigh behind.
you